Welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. My name is Michael LeBlanc, and I am your host. This podcast is produced in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Meet Dr. Rebecca Homkes, who talks about the thinking behind her latest book, Survive, Reset, Thrive, Leading Breakthrough Growth Strategy in Volatile Times, a must-read book that offers a powerful framework for navigating today's volatile business environment. We start with an introduction to Rebecca's background and professional journey before delving into the book's central theme, volatility in today's business environment. While it may seem that volatility has always been a part of professional life, the author explains why today's uncertainty is unique and why retail leaders should stop relying solely on traditional planning tools. Instead, they should embrace preparation to better adapt to unpredictable shifts. We explore how thinking that uncertainty can benefit challengers over incumbents is maybe asking the wrong question, why preparation is vital, and the practical tools leaders can use to thrive in ambiguity. Let's listen in now. Rebecca, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm excellent. Thank you so much for having me.
You are a global traveler. You were just saying you're in Toronto, you live in Miami, San Francisco, and London. Where am I finding you today?
I'm actually at home in Miami. Very sunny Miami today, which is a joy to be home, as you know, when you're on the road most of the time. Yes.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Well, thanks again for joining me. I got a copy of your book a couple of weeks ago. Love it, and I got a bunch of questions for you. But before we get into that, let's talk about you for a bit. Tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and what you generally do for a living.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. So I'm a high growth strategy specialist, which means I focus every single day on growth strategy. So that's developing strategy, executing strategy, and innovating on strategy. I'm a faculty member at the London Business School and Duke, and advisor and faculty at Boston Consulting Group U, but spend over 80% of my time working directly with CEOs and executive teams who want to take their company on a high growth journey.
Now, do you describe yourself as an academic or a consultant?
I'm a hybrid of both, right? So I've got the PhD, I work in a business school, and just enough time to be in the business school, but I like to be out there. I want to be working directly with teams doing it. So it's about 80-20, 80 consulting and advising and 20% in the business schools.
I guess that real world practice helps you in if you're interested in doing things like publishing and doing reports, right? In the kind of professional PhD side of it, yeah?
Yeah, it matters because everything that I talk about in the book or on a day-to-day basis, or frankly, when I'm in the business school, I always start the day by saying, we're not going to spend time on a single framework, a single tool, a single story, right, that I don't use, in the real world with companies who are trying to grow. There's nothing theoretical about a growth strategy. You've got to come from practical experience. Right
on. So your book, Survive, Reset, Thrive. Now, it's based on a framework that we're in volatile times. Hard to argue with that we're in volatile times. But I've had this discussion with a couple of guests around this perceptual, I don't know, I wouldn't call it perceptual bias. But if you and I were having this conversation April 2020, if we were having this conversation, we would think it would be volatile times. Now, So my question is this a perception that we all have all the time? That, boy, things are crazy. I mean, it's a crazy day today. It was 20 years ago. Or is there something materially different about the times we live in today that could say, listen, this is more volatile, faster moving than our predecessors who did the kind of same work that we do?
Yeah. Michael, I love this question. I love this question because I ask this question to entrepreneurs and CEOs all the time, right? Because I'm also obsessed with this question. When I say, I do, strategy and uncertainty, I love it when someone will say back, well, have I ever grown a company in certain times? And so I started challenging people, are we facing more uncertainty now? What's different? And a friend and colleague of mine who was the founder of Match.com about a year and a half ago, he said, I'll tell you what's different, Rebecca. Is that, when we were growing, that first tech model company, in 99, 2000, when we were growing companies through 08 or 09, there was market uncertainty, there was tech uncertainty, and sure, there was geopolitical uncertainty, but we could take geopolitical stability as a given, and that's different now. And that's one piece. And I am not one of those hyperbolic, tech evangelists, but I will go out to say it's different now, Michael, right? It is presenting a sea change of things at the same time, right? When we are hyper connected and all of these other things are in place. So when I combine the strengthened geopolitical uncertainty, ESG and climate and sustainability agenda with AI and tech digital transformation, it is putting a new level of uncertainty into people trying to run and lead companies.
I sometimes present a chart when I'm doing keynotes that shows the speed or the amount of months to get to 100 million users. And you've probably seen a similar chart, starting at, whatever you want, Facebook, and ending up in Chat GPT. I mean, it is that inherent escalation of speed. Do you think that's novel?
I think we're thinking it's novel now, and maybe in another year, we're going to wonder why we ever thought TikTok or ChatGPT was fast, right? In some ways, like you hope you're in that world, right? Because you always think you're at the peak and that kind of the climax of change. I think there's some novelty in going back into this hyperconnectivity times that we live in, which matters for leaders in your industry. But I'm certainly not going to think that we're plateauing anytime soon.
Interesting. You touched on this earlier in some of your comments. When I had this question about an upside, basically, to volatile times. I thought that was, I'm having trouble with that word. Volatile times are not so good for incumbents, but they're great for challengers, right?
I'm going to challenge you back, Michael. So you know who they're great for? They're great for either incumbents or challengers who are learners. Volatile times are great for learners. And here's what I mean by that. I'm not being cliche. Is uncertainty is a great time to grow because it's a great time to learn. In periods of uncertainty, your customers and consumers are never more honest and clear about what they want, what they value, what they need. And so organizations that can lean into uncertainty to really kind of shorten those critical learning loops, those are going to be the ones that grow faster. And challengers, have the advantage of having no historical legacy. And we often call it protectionist bias, right? I've got to protect my current business model. So that often gives them a leg up. But incumbents should have the learning advantage because they're sitting on the data and existing customers to learn from.
It's interesting because, I think about what you're saying in the context of breaking through that innovator's dilemma, right? Look, we're so good. It's hard to replicate that kind of success, but you need some kind of external shock or exogenous shock or something that kind of wake you up. And that's an intriguing part, I think, of your book too, as well, is like how it's kind of like the frog in the boiling water, to use a bit of an overused cliche, but how do you know there's trouble? And let's say things are going pretty good, right? And do you throw yourself on a mindset of like, it's going pretty good, but we should really be worried it's going well? Like when you talk to your clients, how do they articulate that, and how do you put that into your framework?
Absolutely. And that goes into the whole premise of Survive, Reset, Thrive, is that growth is a loop, not a line. And any sort of linear checklist or planning tool makes us go through a checklist and then great, you're done, you're growing and awesome, right? And it never really tells you how you go back to step zero. Right? And in the world that we're living and you're going through these constant cycles or shocks, there's going to be a market or industry shock, which are also internal. You could lose a major customer, major investor. You need to reset or change, then go back to thriving. And what's interesting, Michael, is not the shocks, because shocks are a forcing discipline. When there's a major market shock, like, surprisingly high interest rates or a surprise election result or a Brexit or a COVID or a war, you almost know you need to pause and reset the strategy after you've gone through the stabilized phase. The much harder resets are the ones that you're mentioning, where things are actually going pretty well. Right. What I call a linear growth trap. And it's a linear growth trap because every year you're growing a bit and things are okay enough to not disrupt it. They're not bad enough to feel you need to change, but they're not great. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, calling it the forced reset. You need to put a discipline in place in your organization that about every 3 years, you break apart that assumption, I can do just another rolling strategy because things are pretty much working, and force yourself to challenge and question those assumptions again. So I'm a pretty big fan of the forced reset. Now, you could come out of that, Michael, and say, you know what, like we're going to keep roughly the same strategy. I'm cool with that. I'm not cool not going without the pause.
Let's talk about that culturally. So, I had the opportunity when I was just in Dallas, and had the opportunity to interview a gentleman who was running transformation for Nike. And we talked about this idea around, needing to reset and understanding what place we're in today. Talk about your thoughts on that.
I was speaking about Nike earlier today, so it sounds like, Nike needs the book, right? Because this is exactly what they're going for. This is almost what I call a hard reset, right? And a hard reset is where you go through and you're challenging those critical questions we ask ourselves in strategy. What's the situation? How's it going to change? And what is success? So where are we going to play? How are we going to win? What could stop us? And what should we do? And you can get comfortable, right? And you can not really reassess those questions. And the ones we reassess the least frequently, yet are the most critical, is what are our beliefs? What's going on and how is it going to change? And what is our right to win? And when you go through those and everything's been challenged, you need to do this hard reset and say, we actually need to go back to the basics. What are the key trends that are going to shape our industry going forward? And more critically, what are our beliefs on those? What is our right to win in this current world? What do we have that others don't? What can we do that others can't? And how can we build those moats? And that process of going through it takes months, unfortunately. Not days or weeks. And you got to have the patience to go through that hard reset. And I can't remember a time when we saw so many big, notable brands having to go through one at the same time.
Sure.
CVS, Nike, Starbucks, some would argue Disney, right?
Yeah.
And Nike, all of these big brands, and they're all having to go through these at roughly the same time.
Yeah, interesting. I was in the Chicago roastery, and I thought it was a very good articulation, so to speak, of what's great about Starbucks and what troubles them, right? It's a beautiful experience. It's a wonderful environment. You watch the coffee move through the sky, but it takes you 30 minutes to get a cup of coffee, right? So you're kind of trying to deal with those two things. I wanted to just hang on that for one more minute.
Yeah,
so
let's hang.
Let's talk about organizationally. And we talked about this. I often talked about this with people who have kind of a transformation agenda in their title, right in their title. And of course, you're going to tell me that the change of this magnitude has to happen from the top down.
Yeah.
But okay, the big leaders have a lot to do. They still got to put numbers on the board while we're going. Have you got a framework for an optimal organizational structure? Is this an iterative thing? You have a C-level executive who's in charge of change or transformation or, I guess, planning. I mean, that's pretty standard, though you as you say, stop planning and start preparing. Talk about organizational setup.
No, great question. I'm afraid it's one of those annoying, horses for courses, right? There is not an optimal structure. And believe me, if I thought there was one optimal structure, I would tell you the answer, right? Like, let's stop messing around.
Sure.
There's not, right? And, let's go old school strategy. Like, structure follows strategy, right? Structure follows strategy. Now, in a hard reset, we need a small kind of tiger team making these tough choices, challenging the assumptions, doing some testing.
It's like a red team almost, right?
Almost a red team.
Takes the strategy and said, let's assume everything in that is wrong.
Exactly. And that is exactly the thought exercise culture you've got to do. And so you need explicit buy-in and permission from the top, but the top doesn't have to lead or facilitate those conversations. In fact, he or she should probably not. But if they're not involved in those conversations, they won't go anywhere. Because everyone having those conversations will just wait to see if the CEO, rubber stamps it. So they need to be involved, but they don't necessarily need to facilitate. You need someone who is trusted, right? Who can help get to the insights, who knows how to drive the learning velocity and can help the process along. Now, if you're big enough that you have a chief strategy officer, that could be that individual. But then they really need to change their title to chief learning officer, right? And help us to learn the most about the market in that time. So I'm agnostic to the title that individual has, as long as he or she knows the mandate that they're in charge of at that period of time.
Have you
small
played that?
Team, clear decision making, and give it the time that it needs.
Have you played that role in your consulting work? Is that a role that you would take on, or that people who would take on that? As you say, for mid-sized companies, it's a big bite to have a chief strategy officer, right? But
for mid-sized companies, that's a role I will play. For larger companies, I will get the thing started, right? And then help find the right person to come in and do that. So it depends on the size of the company of how much of that role that I play. But one of my big roles is also helping to push there. And, luckily, and maybe that's just kind of selection bias. I work with organizations who have usually acknowledged that they need to be there. And what's funny is the language is helpful. Is that when you give leaders a language that they can not only grasp onto, but very, very clearly communicate to the wider organization with a pathway out, many see it as liberating. Because they can finally say, hey, let's acknowledge the situation we're in. Like, we need to go into the survive mode. But no, like, we've got to, we're working on this. We're going to go into the reset, give us the time, which will be months, not weeks, to get out of that. And then we'll go back to being a thriving organization. And I know it sounds simple, but, as human beings, we like visual messaging. We like stories. And it helps leaders to have the time that they need when their leaders see this as a loop, like we're going through. And it's natural that we're back at this place of the loop, because all organization time.
It's an interesting point. Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the difference between planning and preparing, and let's talk about the traditional planning tools that maybe aren't suited for the times we're in.
I know. Look, I'm pushing a lot on this one, and I know I'm ruffling some feathers in doing so, but we need to make a pretty big shift from planning to preparing. Now, we're not throwing planning away, okay? There's still many parts of the organization where planning might still be needed. And planning is great when the past is a good indicator of the future, or when we can build models of what's going to happen next. But when that's not the case, we've got to shift into preparation mode, where we're making decisions based on beliefs, not waiting for facts. And now, again, let me pause. I know that sounds scary, especially to my data scientists who are listening. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, we've invested all of this money in our database.
Wait a minute, I got this AI tool working on this.
Exactly. And data is great and data is helpful, but by definition, LLMs are based and trained on historical data, right? Sure. Usually more than a year old, and we are using them to tell us what's going to happen next, right, in a changing, volatile time. So data is one thing that we bring in, as well as customer conversations and interviews and other things that we're doing to set and act on these beliefs. When we shift from planning to preparing, we set milestones, not always metrics. Prematurely assigning metrics or KPIs often feels like the good thing because we've got discipline, they'll say. But, if we have a metric too early, I could be leading the organization in the wrong place. And so I like to, Michael, call what I say a direction rather than a destination, because we still need to give the team alignment, because this weird paradox of uncertainty is the more uncertainty we're facing, as so many retailers are right now, the more their teams are begging them from alignment. But we can't give them perfect alignment right now because so much is changing. So we need to give the direction, even if we can't commit to that precise destination. Think of the difference between holding a compass and saying, hey, we're going northwest, versus taking a road trip and saying, we're taking exit 405 for Santa Monica. Directions are enough to give the alignment that you need.
Interesting. I often hear, it reminds me of what phrase I often hear when I'm talking to people about their ambitions, they call them, for sustainability practices, right? They don't set goals, they set ambitions. And I'm like, is that a little bit of a giving you wiggle room? But in your framework, it's not wiggle room. It's kind of setting forth what did you say, a direction or a roadmap?
It's a direction. Now, you need enough clarity to make decisions. Like, that's always your task. Like, let's take a step back. That's why we talk about all this stuff, right? We need growth strategies so we can make decisions at speed and scale, right? Is if you're a small company of 2, you actually don't need a strategy because you can make very fast decisions at speed and scale. But when you get larger, in order to make these aligned decisions at speed and scale, we need strategy. So we can make choices that align with other choices in a speed that's enough to matter. So the direction or the ambition needs to be clear enough to guide choices. So it can't be, fluffy or foo-foo, but it doesn't need to be that precise destination.
Let's talk about some examples. So you have one great example that of course, close to my heart, IKEA, and hearing that you telling me that people will stock their own or
love that story.
Yeah, I love that. I love that story. But so you could elaborate on that one. But what other stories have you got from perhaps?
Let's catch listeners up who might not know the IKEA story. Then we'll tell some more recent ones. So I love the IKEA story because the punchline, there was a big VAT change over a weekend. And so this furniture retailer who was pushed out of the city center, like, let's not forget, they were not loved by their industry peers. So they were pushed out of the city center. And they had this surprise big spur in shopping because, again, there was going to be a big VAT change the next weekend. So they were just inundated with customers. And out of mere frustration, the store manager said, we can't do this. He said to the employees, just tell the customers to go to the warehouse, pick up what they want, and then come check out. And they have to put it in their cars themselves. So they did that. And then the next Monday morning, he just went cowering to his boss, at the regional headquarters, just, ready to beg forgiveness for this disastrous weekend that he'd had. And the head guy said, so hold on. The customers were willing to go to the warehouse and pick it up? Yeah. They put it in the cars themselves? Yeah. And they're happy? Yeah. Okay, well, that's what we're doing now. And I'm simplifying it, but that's essentially what happened, Michael. And they were able to really just take advantage of this surprise and this uncertainty and change everything. And there's so many great examples of companies doing this by being willing to lean in and learn. Now, one of my favorite examples is a smaller company, and it's in hospitality. It's in zoos and amusement parks. And it's actually based in Scandinavia, not far from the IKEA headquarters. And during COVID, they were down to a 20% capacity restriction. Think about that. Think your store, and many people in your industry were, right?
Yeah.
And despite
if they were open at all, they were open at all.
They were closed for several months. When they were finally allowed to open, they had to open in a weekend in a process that usually took them 3 months. They had 20% capacity. And they had their most profitable, highest growth, highest customer engagement, and highest employee engagement year ever. Results they kept the next year on and still do today. And you say, well, how did they do that? How did they take the biggest disaster, hand it to this company in over 100 years and turn it around? Because they leaned into the uncertainty. They told their customers they were going to make mistakes. They implemented all the stuff they had never done, dynamic pricing, going cashless, going to glamping or a 24-hour park. So empowering the team, trying all of these things out and leaning in. And the other really cool thing that they did is they split the entire team into two, offense and defense. Nice. Because what they found was that even though the CEO had told the team explicitly, it's time to grow again. Like, we have survived. The memory of that survive phase was so strong. I mean, it was the same summer. The team couldn't let go. They were still too much in that mindset. And he realized people couldn't do both. And he likened it to playing soccer, what in Europe we call football. He said, you would never ask one player to play offense and defense. They'd be running up and down the field all day and exhaust themselves, right? We know that in sports. So why do we ask our leaders to play both roles? So we split the team into two, offense and defense. They had separate meetings, separate huddles with complete trust. I want to pause on the word trust. You can only do things like this if trust is high across the company.
When you think of the COVID year, let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah.
When I talk to CEOs, they, I wouldn't say it's a regret, but their ambition or their hope was that we could, as an organization, make decisions as fast as we did in COVID. I hear that a lot.
I know.
And part of that, part of that is we all had a mission, and that mission unified us. We had to get through this, right? And, it's a little harder to have, fortunately, that's mostly behind us. But do you think there are any lasting, lasting changes in thought about maybe this whole thing about I need to first survive and then do, like, it seemed like it got captured in your model, but what do you think about COVID and its lasting?
There is a capability there. When teams tell me we're at our best in a crisis, which is a common thing you'll hear from teams, and they say it almost with a pride, right? And the real growth capability is, how can you take the best of how we act in a crisis, remove the crisis, and keep it on a run rate we can sustain? That's what you need to do, Michael, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm making it sound simple in words, but that is the capability you're trying to do. And I call it, let me simplify even more, I call it aligned speed, right? Is you want this very clear value-creating strategy, right, which could have a direction or a destination, because you need the alignment, right? But alignment without speed is too slow to matter, right? But speed without alignment is chaos, right? So we need these two things together, right?
Somebody described that to me as all thrust, no vector.
Yes. So aligned speed. So we're going to take the best of how we act in a crisis, remove the crisis, and put it on a run rate we can sustain. That's what you're trying to do. Don't manufacture a crisis. That's a waste of time. Instead, build that capability of aligned speed.
Any advice as to how leaders can figure out the must-win battles? I've also heard that as in, what are the big bets we're going to make versus the many decisions that need to be made. And I guess filtering that through and said, these 5 things we just have to get right and prioritize. Any model for that?
This will not surprise you, but of course I do. I've got a framework for doing that as well. And look, I'm agnostic to the final language you decide to use. Call them bets, call them must-win battles, call them strategic priorities. I had a frustrating moment with a leader in a summit last summer, and I said, look, I'll call them giraffes, just execute them, right? I can call them whatever you want. I have one rule. The word has to have integrity. So whatever word you're using for those top 4 or 5 company-wide growth priorities, that word's not used on anything else. So if it's priorities, if it's goals, if it's bets, again, can be whatever you want, but then that word is now protected. You can only refer to those things. So that's step 1. Then you got to go finish line back, not activity forward. And that sounds simple, and it's insane how many companies still don't do it. The number one reason companies don't execute their strategies is they have no idea what it would look like if they did. Because we have strategies and long PowerPoint presentations and lists of KPIs and OKRs and goals, aims, objectives, we've all got a list of stuff to do, but no clear sense of how my decisions align with your decisions. So you start with the finish line. What defines success? Just anchor the picture of a finish line, a marathon or crossing over a finish line. Once you've aligned on the finish line and you've done the hard work of aligning on your beliefs and right to win first, then you can set the priorities to get there. Any strategy process that starts with, hey, everyone write their top 10 things down, we'll put them on a board, we'll vote with flip notes and sticky notes and get to our final 5. Like, just stop doing that. You're always going to get to the wrong answer. Finish line back based on our beliefs and right to win.
Interesting. Last couple of questions. Yeah. Geopolitical tensions, increasing trade protectionism, huge climate events. Your fellow Floridians just went through one, North Carolina.
There's very little going on this week, isn't there, Michael? Yes. Yeah.
Goodness, it's a long. We could spend half a podcast just listing all the crazy things that are happening. How do you advise your clients, the leaders, and how should leaders think about that as they're making their plans? Yeah. I mean, some just seem too big to get their head around or our heads around, and maybe how does that look? I'm a retailer, and how do you put all that together and come up with a framework?
Yeah, love this question. I'm actually, my blog next month is going to focus on this question. I'm going to just call it macro matters, because macro does matter for strategy, right? But macro can also be a distraction in that we can spend hours, and we did, right, talking about the sustainability agenda, talking about the election, talking about kind of all of these different aspects. And so how do we channel what we need to do? And I'm going to make it simple. It's going to sound too simple, but let's talk through it. With your team, you need to answer this question. We are seeing X, comma, and we believe Y for 2027, comma, which means Z for us. Like, this is a trend we're seeing right now. This is our belief on how that's going to move and shape over the next 2 to 4 years, because we want that 3-year sweet spot. And this is the implication for us. And that middle part, the belief, is the power move. What tends to happen, especially to more entrepreneurial leaders, is they see a trend and they jump right to the implication. I'm seeing possible tariffs. We must do X. We must nearshore. I'm going a little bit extreme. Sure. I am seeing consumer shopping behavior change to X. We must do this. Hold on. That middle piece is where you spend your time. That's strategy. What's our belief? Because we're making choices based on our beliefs. And the power in that is we can test our beliefs. We're going to get feedback on those beliefs way before we get feedback on our choices. So macro matters, but to avoid it being a distraction, use that sentence in only the trends that have a high impact to the industry and high criticality to your strategy. Those are the ones that we're going to move forward with.
So the book is Survive, Reset, Thrive, Leading Breakthrough Growth Strategy in Volatile Times. It's been such an interesting conversation. If folks want to get in touch with you directly, learn more about your work, the book's available at all the great places, I'm sure, but if they want to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Yeah, would love it. Again, a book is available in all the places that you buy books, and you can connect with me directly, watch some videos, learn more. Just go to surviveresetthrive.com. Again, it's just surviveresetthrive.com.
Well, Rebecca, it's been such a treat speaking with you. A fascinating book. I recommend it to everybody, and a fascinating discussion. So thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to chat with me here at the Voice of Retail podcast. And I wish you continued success and a great rest of your day.
It was my absolute pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, follow on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically each week. And be sure and check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast with Steve Dennis and the Global E-Commerce Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, Senior Retail Advisor, Keynote Speaker. If you want more content or chat, follow me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.